Okay, so I am ready to split up this sourdough starter and feed it so that I can start baking in a little bit. Now, the reason I normally try to do this as early as possible is my sourdough starter in my temperature kitchen usually takes about 4 to 5 hours before it's ready to bake with. So I try to get an early start. It is just before 8 a.m. So probably I'm going to be looking at about noon or 1 before I'm ready to actually start mixing this into my dough. The other thing is my dough ratio. So if you've never baked before, this was all new to me, but there's what's called baker's ratios. And the cool thing about that, for a simple dough recipe, like a sourdough recipe, everything is done in percentages so that you can adjust it depending on if you want to make a half, like a small loaf, a full loaf, 2 loaves, 6 loaves, or 12 loaves. So all it changes is the percentages, and it's all based on the amount of flour. So I don't like to do hard math. So my 2 loaf dough is based on 1,000 grams of flour, and I usually do a 75% water ratio to begin with, because when I'm doing my stretch and folds, I'm going to be wetting my hands and adding water, and I think I probably end up more around an 80%, which is what I like. So 75% of it, based on 1,000 grams of flour, would be 750 grams of water. And my ratio calls for 20%. This is kind of high. There are bakers out there that would tell you this is high, but I like about 20% of starter. And so that's 200 grams of starter and about 2% of salt. So that's anywhere from 15 to 20 grams of salt. And that's it. That is all that is in this bread. There are no chemicals, no preservatives. It is just flour, water, and salt, and very little salt at that. So the other thing I really like about, and I meant to say this before, people ask me, there's a lot of people that don't eat a lot of bread. They try to avoid carbs. There are a lot of diets where you maybe want to limit your grains. There's a lot of talk about gluten, gluten intolerance, gluten sensitivities. And so bread has become kind of this evil thing in our minds. And the reason I like sourdough, and it doesn't mean you can just eat as much of it as you want, but sourdough is actually a fermented dough. And what happens with this starter, instead of using a commercial yeast, this is a wild yeast. And what happens is it actually starts to consume some of the sugars and the gluten. It breaks down the gluten in your dough. So it's actually a lot easier to digest. For people who sometimes get stomach upset from bread, it's easier to digest. For people who have mild gluten sensitivities, they find that sourdough doesn't bother them at all. And because this is fresh and there's no preservatives, I don't use chemically bleached flours. It's just kind of overall, it's a better choice for you. So I use organic flours. I try to buy the best quality flour I can afford. I use spring water, so it's got no fluorides or chemicals. This is not tap water. So just trying to keep it as clean as pure so that when you do eat bread, you're actually getting some of the health benefits and you're not adding anything to the chemicals and all that other stuff that's in commercial bread. So anyway, so what you want to do, because it's all based on weights and percentages, and this is not a fancy production studio, so when I tell you the weights, you're gonna have to just trust me. So what I do, these tools make life a lot easier, but they're not absolutely necessary. So you can make do with whatever you have. And I'll even show you that more when we get to the point where we're proofing the bread. I have these really cool cane bannetons that I proof them in. They're ideal, but they're not absolutely necessary. And so just like this, I would say just because everything is based on weight, you would want to get some kind of a kitchen scale, and they're really inexpensive. I've seen them for like $9.99. So what you do is take your container that you're going to put your starter in, and you hit tare on your scale. If you're like me and you have no idea what tare meant, before. It just means that it's going to take whatever you've placed on the square and it's going to subtract it out to get you to a 0 reading, because all I'm interested in is the weight of what I'm putting in there. So I start with, I want about 200 grams, I want a little over actually, 200 grams of finished starter. And I'm going to be adding flour and water to this starter. So I'm going to put, and I do that at a ratio of about 3 to 1. And that's a tip that I picked up. When I first started doing this, a lot of videos were saying 1 to 1. So if you had 50 grams of starter, it would tell you to put 50 grams flour, 50 grams of water. What I picked up from a baker that I followed, who I thought had phenomenal results, she actually does a much higher ratio. Some people will feed up to a 5 to 1 ratio. And that just depends on how often you bake and how much starter you use, because that, you know, you can imagine if you start with, you know, someone who feeds 5 to 1 probably starts with very little starter. And I'm putting myself on the spot here because I'm gonna have to do math, but if you started even with 10 grams of starter, which is, I mean, that's basically a teaspoonful of starter, and you added 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water, then that's gonna get you, that's still only gonna get you to 110 grams, but it doesn't actually work out to be exactly that once it's finished. I just kind of do the 3 to 1. I think I would love to play around a little bit more with a higher ratio, but at this point I'm just kind of sticking with what I've been doing and what I'm working with. So let me do some quick math in my head. I believe if I've been doing about 40 grams of starter. I'll do 120 grams of flour and 120 grams of water, and that gets me a little bit over that 200 gram mark, so that I have the full 200 when I go to put this in my dough. So don't make the mistake that I make all the time, is I get distracted and my tare on my scale turns off and I start putting my starter in, and then I have no idea how much I have in there, so I have to start over. So make sure you tare it nice and fresh, and then I am just gonna put 40 grams. And it's gonna happen pretty quickly. I'm already at 24. Oh, okay. So I'm at 43, that's fine. It doesn't have to be that exact. And you can see I still have quite a bit of starter in there. And I'll tell you what I do with that extra in a minute. So this is my flour blend. This is my bread flour and my rye flour. I've tried different ones. There's a mill up in the Northwest called Bluebird. I really like the concept because the farmer actually grows the grains organically and grinds it into flour and ships it. So there's not a lot of middlemen. I love that concept. Some of the grains, and I just maybe need to do a little bit more research on what they offer, but the grains seemed to be a little bit more coarsely ground, and I struggled with that a little bit in my dough and my gluten development. Then I tried Sunrise Flours, which I love. They do a lot of heirloom grains, more organic, and you can get some really cool flours and grains. They're a little pricier though, so for if you are on a budget and you're trying to bake regularly, and you know this stuff doesn't have preservatives in it, so it's only really good for a few days. So you don't want to invest a lot of money into this bread if it's not going to get eaten. So what I've done, sometimes I just want to be able to run to the grocery store, and as much as possible, I will buy up whatever organic King Arthur flour my grocery store has. And I have ordered directly from King Arthur to get like some pumpernickel flours and stuff like that. But if you just want to do just a nice basic sourdough loaf, then I would say some organic bread flour with maybe a little bit of rye, and you can get spelt, but you probably have to order that online. But this is just bread flour and rye. And this is what I use to feed my starter, so that's what my starter's used to. All right, so I'm still sitting at 43 with my starter in here. So what I want is 120 of my flour. I'm gonna re-tare that because I don't wanna do the math. Okay, so my scale's gone back to 0. And 107. There we go. 121. That's close enough. And then what I'm gonna do, and I can do this math, now I'm gonna add my natural spring water. So this is not purified water, it's not tap water, it's spring water. And the reason I prefer spring water, so you definitely don't want tap water because the chlorine in tap water will completely kill your starter. And purified water, it's basically tap water that they've cleaned. And in that cleaning process and that treatment process, they're also stripping out a lot of the beneficial minerals and stuff like that that they end up having to add back in. So I prefer spring water if at all possible. And I use spring water for my kefir, my kombucha, my vinegars. So we keep big jugs of spring water around the house here. All right, so I'm at 121. I'm gonna add 120 of water. So I'm gonna be at 240. 244. Okay, sometimes I get there a lot more quickly than I realize. Okay, so all I need to do now, and I have found there is no fancy gadget that you need for stirring your starter. A regular butter knife works perfectly. You just want to make sure you stir it really, really well because you don't want any pockets of flour, and you want to make sure that that starter gets mixed all the way through so that it's fermenting evenly. So I just give it just a really good stir, get a good arm workout, make sure it goes all the way through, and I'll just use the reason I like a butter knife is because I'll just use the edge of that just to kind of scrape down the sides and get everything incorporated. And different people have different preferences on the consistency of their sourdough starter. I find I like it, let's see if I can show you. Here we go. I like it kind of a thick pancake batter consistency. All right, so that's it. I will take my knife and clean it. I find with the sourdough starter, it's unlike other things like my kefir water, my kombucha, I'll put a coffee filter over it so it can breathe. This, I just use a loosely fitting, the glass lid that comes with these weck jars. Oh yeah, and that's how I got sidetracked. I was starting to talk about equipment. I get these weck jars from Amazon, and I absolutely love them. I use them for a ton of stuff. And this particular size is, I believe, 3/4 of a liter. It's their number 743, and you can usually buy them in like sets of 6 or 12. They're not terribly expensive, but they're really, really worth it because I use them a ton, and they're perfect for this. Now what I'll do is I'll just grab a rubber band, and I'll mark where that line is. Oops. And it doesn't have to be exact because it's not going to be an even line all the way around, and this is kind of a thick rubber band, but basically I'm just marking it so that I can see how high this has risen. And what I'm looking for on each of these jars, I want this to at least triple. So if you have a good, healthy starter, in the 4-ish hours, depending on all your conditions, this should at least triple. So I'm looking for it to get at least up to here. What I'm really looking for, and I'm gonna start checking, is it's gonna have, as it's growing, it's gonna have a really dome shape, and I'll definitely jump on and show that to you. So as it's growing, it's got kind of this cupped top, and it's growing upwards. When it gets to a certain point where it's kind of running out of food and it's time to bake with it, what will happen is that cup on top will just start to flatten out a little bit. At that point, that's when you want to add it to your dough. If it starts to deflate and it's actually concave, that means it's really time to get it into your dough. It's maybe even too late. And if it starts to sink in the jar, it really is kind of too late, and it's probably not gonna, you can still make bread with it, you're probably just not going to get as much of a rise and stuff from your bread, but it's still going to be edible, so it's totally fine. So I'm going to do that for all 3 jars. I will jump back on and show you what that looks like as it's growing and as I'm waiting for, bless you. I'm going to show you what that looks like as it's growing. I'll check in with you and kind of let you know where we're at time-wise, so that if you're doing this yourself, you can kind of see how you're comparing as time passes. And then, of course, we'll go ahead and start with the next steps. Probably about the time I jump back on, at least 2 hours before I think my starter is going to be ready, I want to do the next step, which is called autolyse. And all that means is I'm going to go ahead and mix the rest of my flour and my water together and really let, for lack of a better word, I'm really going to let that flour and that water get to be best buddies for a couple of hours before I add anything else to it. It's called autolyse. It just hydrates the flour. It starts that gluten development. Everybody's getting to know each other and get happy. And like I said, I do that for at least a couple hours if I can, and then I go ahead and add my sourdough starter. So that'll be the next check-in. I'll talk to you in a little bit.